Representatives, the Qantas Group.
Okay, so we'll have to see you on video.
Oh, okie dokie. Thanks, mate. Thank you, Jerry. All right, gents, the music's going to stop and you'll still be standing. Okay, now I welcome representatives from the Qantas Group, and if you could please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today. And I do note on teleconference, is that Mr. David on teleconference?
It is, yes.
Can you hear us, Mr. David?
Yes, I can, loud and clear.
Well, I've got you at the top of the list. Would you like to start first, please? If you could just give us your name and the capacity in which you appear today.
Andrew David, and I'm the CEO of Qantas Domestic and Qantas International.
Thank you very much. Long time no see. It must be all of about 12 months. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Senators. My name is Andrew Parker and I'm the Group Executive for Government, Industry, International and Sustainability at the Qantas Group. I'm joined on my left by Andrew Finch, who is our Chief Counsel and Group Executive for the Office of the CEO, and as you said, Chair, Andrew David, who is the CEO of Qantas Domestic and International, on the phone.
Right, tremendous. Okay, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to make an opening statement, so I will look probably towards Mr. David, is that correct?
I'm going to give the opening statement.
You are,
Mr.
Parker?
Chair.
Okay, fire away.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to appear, to make a brief statement and obviously take your questions. Last week, the Qantas Group recorded a significant half-year and sadly a record half-yearly loss, just over $1 billion at an underlying level and almost $1.5 billion at a statutory level for the 6 months to December 2020. Border closures, as you know and you've heard in other testimony, has meant that we have lost virtually 100% of our international flying and 70% of our domestic flying for the half. 3/4 of our revenue, about $7 billion, went with it, and that's on top of the $4 billion hit we took to revenue in the 6 months prior. The COVID-19 pandemic is the single greatest threat and crisis our industry, all airlines, has ever faced. Health measures implemented by governments to contain COVID-19, which we all agree have been critically important, nonetheless devastated travel demand almost overnight. Airline revenues collapsed, entire fleets, such as our entire A380 fleet, were grounded, and the world's biggest carriers were forced to take extreme measures just to survive. We believe the Qantas Group entered the crisis in better shape than most, but it has still hit us very hard and the impact will be felt for a long time as we recover. To position ourselves for several years where revenues will be much lower, Qantas has acted swiftly to hibernate our business, to reduce costs and preserve liquidity. In June 2020, we announced a 3-year plan to guide our recovery with 3 immediate actions to safeguard Qantas's future and the many jobs it supports. Those measures were reducing our workforce, our fleet and our capital spend for a world where there will be less flying for an extended period, restructuring to deliver ongoing savings across the group's operations, and recapitalising through an equity raise and increased borrowings that strengthened our balance sheet. COVID-19 and the subsequent international and state border closures have had a devastating impact on tens of thousands of our people. But the collapse of many billions of dollars of revenue leaves us little choice if we are to save as many jobs as possible over the longer term. An example of one of the necessary but very difficult changes that we have made has been to the outsourcing of ground handling at the remaining 10 airports where work was still being done in-house. This process is now largely complete and will deliver significant benefits to the group, including reducing the overall cost of our ground handling operations by about $100 million a year and avoiding us spending about $80 million on heavy equipment over the next 5 years. And in this environment, these benefits cannot be ignored. We have used specialist ground handlers at many Australian airports for decades, and they've proven they can deliver a safe and reliable service more efficiently than is currently done in-house. The twists and turns of recent months have shown us that this recovery is going to take longer and be more volatile than many expected. International borders are unlikely to open until late October this year, and domestic borders have continued to compromise our recovery, with December and January closures costing us in the vicinity of $400 million. While COVID-19 is under control in Australia than it has been prior, more control, confidence to travel is lower than it has been at prior reopenings. Leisure and business travellers are confused by a patchwork of rapidly changing restrictions and are understandably worried about being locked out of their own home state or intended destination. The well-publicised stories of families driving through the night over the Christmas break to beat sudden closures, or passengers informed mid-air on their way to Perth that they can no longer enter the state that was open to them when they started their flight, has shattered confidence. The flow-on impacts for tourism and the broader economy are obviously severe. Before the December outbreak, we were seeing pent-up demand for travel and a considerable increase in frequencies across most of our interstate markets. We had stood up staff and readied aircraft to meet that demand. In our December 3, 2020 market update, we indicated we were aiming to reach approximately 80% of our pre-COVID capacity for Q3 2021. In the 4 days following Sydney's Northern Beaches outbreak, passenger cancellations for Qantas flights ex-Sydney increased by almost 50%. Jetstar was also hit hard, with passenger numbers reducing by 36,000 for departures between the 17th and the 31st of December. In the months of December and January, Qantas had to cancel over 4,800 flights across the network. Traditionally, as you know, airlines have a summer schedule and a winter schedule. During COVID, Qantas and Jetstar have had schedules on a weekly basis. We developed systems to manage almost constant change to travel restrictions that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Any chance of sustainable domestic recovery is contingent on state and territory borders remaining open. We know that people are keen to travel when they have confidence in borders. In a survey of selected Qantas customers in January, 7 out of 10 respondents said that uncertainty of restrictions being changed again was the highest barrier to flying. For our business travellers, uncertainty of border closures impacting travel, including the ability to get home, was the number one barrier to flying. And as one live example, Andrew David, on the monitors in front of us, is not able to be here today in person because he was in Auckland last month and he can't be essentially in the same room as a West Australian. To us, despite having multiple COVID tests, this is not about risk management. Confidence in borders is essential, and it comes on the back of health advice, obviously. But what we are looking for is an assurance that at a point in time, or at a point in the vaccine rollout, that further border closures will be ruled out. This would significantly improve consumer confidence and travel demand. We are determined to meet that demand and are managing our network and our costs closely so we can seize opportunities and adapt to changing demand patterns as they emerge. Qantas and Jetstar are flying for cash now, deciding that making $1 in the air is better than losing $1 on the ground. 99% of the time we have been able to fly, we have generated positive cash flow. With the vaccine now rolling out to frontline and quarantine workers, there is strong reason to hope that domestic borders closures will soon be a thing of the past. And we think it's imperative that this be a focus of National Cabinet in the coming days and weeks. The vaccine rollout also means that we are now planning for international travel to restart at the end of October this year, which is in line with the date of Australia's vaccine rollout to be effectively complete. We're in close consultation with the federal government on this, and if things change, so will the date. But we think this is a reasonable assumption. Against this background, we are very appreciative of the measures rolled out by the federal government to support the aviation industry since the beginning of the crisis. These measures, whether they be the minimum networks you just discussed, the refunding and ongoing wavering of government charges, and especially JobKeeper, have been critical to support the sector and its people. The assistance has also kept Australia connected, freight moving, and supported critical associated industries such as tourism and trade, and provided work for our people. JobKeeper is by far the biggest form of assistance, and there's an important distinction about the payments we received. While most companies were able to use their whole JobKeeper benefit as a wage subsidy, JobKeeper acted as a social safety net for our people, more than a wage subsidy. At some points, JobKeeper was subsidising wages as few as 20% of our employees, with the remainder flowing directly to the workers stood down. Discussions with the government on continued support for the industry and our people are substantial and ongoing. The continuation beyond March of the aviation support packages, which have underpinned our industry, guaranteed services, and otherwise helped marginal or domestic regional routes to continue with operations, as well as enabled critical air and freight connectivity during the pandemic, are vital. They represent a critical lifeline for our business and our employees. In our view, it is vital that the government extend and enhance all existing aviation support programs, at least until international travel resumes. This should be accompanied by measures we believe to stimulate domestic travel demand and address consumer confidence. We know how difficult this crisis has been on our people. At least 8,500 will have lost their job at the national carrier because of COVID-19 and no fault of their own. By March 31, 2021, approximately 9,000 Qantas Group employees, predominantly attached to our international business, will still be stood down or on leave without pay. Thousands more have had their livelihoods put on hold by what we believe are ad hoc state border closures. In addition to extending and enhancing existing aviation support programs, we have asked the government to consider implementing measures aimed at supporting the training and skill development of these staff in the coming months. Training of this kind will keep employees connected to our business and facilitate the commencement of international flights once our borders reopen. Thankfully, Australia's public health outcome has been one of the best globally, but it has come at a huge cost, and that's why we're focused on recovery. The faster we recover, the sooner most of our people can get back to work. There are some green shoots domestically, but the recent outbreaks have shown us how fragile this is, and we can't be complacent. We stand ready to continue our role in connecting Australia, visiting families, regional centres, local tourism industries, as we recover, all while delivering a high level of care, service, and above all, safety. We're very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Now, before we go any further, are both you gentlemen comfortable with the media snapping photos of you?
Sure.
Okay. Yep. Council, you look worried. Oh, that's all
No,
right. Okay.
I was
All right.
looking for the media. There they are.
Okay, no worries. Thank you very much. Senator Sheldon.
Good, thanks very much, and thanks for joining us this morning. Obviously this is a critical time with COVID and, of course, looking at the post-COVID recovery. What is a vital industry for aviation, of course, as aviation watchers and aviation participants, that you know how critical it is to the Australian economy beyond the obvious aviation consequences, making sure that we connect business, communities, families, and making sure that whether it be right across, of course, educational services as well, and the list goes on. To make sure the tourism industry is properly functioning, it has to have a functioning aviation industry to be successful. So, but I do have to say, just from the outset, that I am disappointed that the CEO, Alan Joyce, hasn't joined us. This is a critical hearing about what we do into the future, and it is a very weighty subject for public interest. We're also very mindful that the Virgin CEO did join us at the hearings in Brisbane, So I want to put that on the record. That is disappointing he's not here, but thank you for your attendance. So as I understand, I've got 3 Andrews and I've got no Alan. So we'll push ahead. There were some questions on notice that we sent you, which I might just ask if you've answered those questions, if we can just hand them up, and I'll just go to some other matters at the moment.
We'll table those
What's the
answers.
questions on notice, either Senator Sheldon? Sorry.
They go through.
Sorry, what?
I haven't seen the questions on notice.
Could we obtain it so that the chair and then certainly the senator, both senators or 3 senators can get it?
Okay, no, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, it's no different than questions being asked by senators that have been prepared days out. So what we can do is have you got the answers to the questions?
We do.
You have? Okay. And you're tabling them, or you?
Happy either to table or
Well,
you want to give us a
table,
brief
yes.
summary?
You want them tabled, Senator Sheldon? So let's table. Okay, you've tabled them, and then Senator McDonald, you can get your copy as soon as it's done.
Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to go to just what's the total cost incurred by Qantas as a result of the 8,500 job cuts, including the cost of redundancy, payment of outstanding entitlements owed, and other related expenses?
The figure we have is $470 million.
That was for the first half of this year. So, Senator, we provided in FY20 about $642 million for redundancies expected after that time, and as Andrew said, in the first half, roughly 470 was paid, but 284 was expensed. So in round swings, about $925 million is the expected cost for the 8,500 redundancies.
Now looking at the points you raised in your opening statement, and of course the degree of uncertainty about border closures and the need for certainty, and I wholeheartedly understand and support that necessity. So what are you telling the workforce, particularly from the international business, but also domestic staff, about future support for the sector and what form it will take? Are you informing the workforce about that?
We have, and that comes in various forms, the town halls, and there's a lot of employee engagement this week, which we do on the back of our results, which is Alan is on a roadshow this week talking to employees as well as investors. And what we have said to staff and more broadly is we want the continuation of the existing programs. So things like the AAFRP package, for example, has been critical for marginal flying. So this is flying that is on a knife edge between generating cash, being cash positive, and the alternative. DANs and RANs, as you know, are also similarly highly important programs that we ask continue at least until the international borders reopen and there is more confidence in the domestic economy. And on JobKeeper, we understand the government's position, which is they've dropped some large hints that it is highly unlikely that JobKeeper will be extended beyond the end of March. So our conversations, while still addressing JobKeeper and its importance, particularly on a sector basis, have also encompassed a range of other initiatives. Skills and training, as we discussed, which we think could be really important for the international workforce to stay connected, to extract maximum training before an international restart, to have financial support for employees and the company in performing that training, as well as other bespoke measures that might be applicable to support particularly our international employees who in a post-JobKeeper world will be without that safety net. And I would just mention one other thing, Senator, which is we continue to work very hard on secondary employment for all of our employees, but particularly, again, the international workforce. And there are hundreds of companies that we have worked for, state governments, the federal government, where thousands of our stood-down workers are still working in those secondary roles. And we know that's not perfect, but we think all of these combination of measures can help us get through until the international borders reopen.
So just the question of, you raised that, so you're of the view that there won't be, whether we call it aviation keeper, a version of JobKeeper not being given to the workforce. You said that these workers will be without a safety net. That's your expectation.
I think, first of all, JobKeeper has obviously been a critical safety net, and I think the government understands for aviation, and particularly for international aviation, that some form of assistance is going to be vital until we can resume that international flying. What I am saying is that it appears, and we take the comments at face value, that JobKeeper is likely to end at the end of March, and we certainly hope that there are a range of measures introduced in a very targeted way for our sector and our employees that will get us through to the international border reopening. We don't know what they are. We've put forward a series of ideas, and the dialogue is on a weekly, sometimes daily basis with government, and I think there is an absolute appreciation of the safety net that these programs have afforded our workforce.
So you've expressed to the government the necessity to have that safety net figure to be able to keep people retained to the business.
We have, yes.
And just on the question of training, and it's in previous evidence, which you may be aware of, pilots and various pilot associations, I'm sure I'm predicting we'll hear similar evidence this afternoon, the need for some training assistance and costs to make sure they can keep their licences.
Yes.
And there's as we know, a number of other areas where licensing is also required. When you say training assistance for those sorts of initiatives, if I understand you correctly, does that extend to new workers coming in, or is that to existing workers?
I think we would characterise it as anyone who is, for example, in our international workforce, which is the primary focus, but not exclusive. There's many domestic workers that we need training to be done on an ongoing basis. Where there is that skills need, and particularly workers have time available to them, or we have this opportunity before the borders reopen, we're looking at pilots, we're looking at cabin crew, engineers, safety managers, and we think the number is in excess of 5,000 people that could be part of an enhanced safety and a skill and training program between now and the border reopening, in addition to what might be the more routine timetable of safety and training. And that's what we're talking to government on, which is support for those costs and support for those workers to do existing and enhanced training.
So I just want to be clear, so you're asking for funding for the existing workforce, or you're asking for the existing workforce and potential future workforce, the requirements that might be needed?
I would characterise it as our current workforce. I don't think we have new employees to be participating in these sorts of programs.
The question's been raised earlier in the hearing about that there's one or the other option. Either people receive financial support so that they can feed their family and keep connected with their employer, or they receive training. Are the options exclusive, or should they be included?
No, you would hopefully have a suite of packages, and as I say, that is everything from continuing to support secondary employment, which has been vital. I think it's continuing to find with government some sort of mechanism for financial support of employees, and then finally other measures that do both training and skills. But there is another element, which is if we can get domestic flying back to levels as close to or matching pre-COVID, obviously for the domestic workforce and some of the wider employees, they're going to be doing far greater work and a lot more flying, which is why domestic borders have been so critical. And that won't address an A380 first officer or a flight attendant dedicated to our international business, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of employees that can be captured who are currently stood down if we have more certainty on borders and more flying activity domestically.
So just picking up that point you just made, at what point would Qantas be considering cutting more jobs, especially from the international business?
I'm conscious of talking a lot. Andrew, David, would you care to comment on that question?
Senator, it really comes back to just unfortunately this uncertain world that we live in. Right now, based on what we know, we're assuming our domestic capacity is at 80% for fourth quarter of this financial year. That's April to June. We're assuming Trans-Tasman is open in July, and we're assuming that we can get 40 to 50% of our international flying back up by November of this year. But as we've all seen, we're living in very, very uncertain times, and borders have been closing, opening, closing, opening. All of that drives impact into our business. The financial impact of the border closures over the Christmas period here in Sydney, Perth, Brisbane, Melbourne, there's a $400 million impact to us, which Andrew referenced. So all we can say at the moment is based on our financial position and our plans, we know of 8,500 redundancies. But if things change, there may be more, and we've got to make sure that when we come through this and out the other end, that we are fighting fit, because we'll be carrying a lot more debt that we've got to pay down. We've issued more shares, and we've also got lean competition out there as well. So this is about as much about ensuring that when we get through the pandemic and the impact on this business, that we're able to stand on our own feet and indeed start growing again and hiring back people into this business, which we were doing in February last year.
Mr. David, just on your point there, and you highlighted the uncertainty of things out of our national control or even state control and certainly business control that can impact on the workforce. And you said that there may be more redundancies if there isn't some form of, I'll just call it aviation keeper. Do you think the likelihood of redundancies is greater?
You can't really pin it on one thing, Senator. There are so many issues. I couldn't tell you right now. I mean, if we saw state borders close again, the impact's going to be huge. I can't tell you whether aviation keeper or any other initiative would be enough to close that gap. I couldn't tell you in November that we were going to see a $400 million impact on this business over the Christmas period. And I certainly couldn't tell you February last year that we were going to see $11 billion of our revenue disappear over 9 months. So I honestly can't give you an answer to that question because I don't know.
And thanks. Yes,
Mr.
Finch.
We've been clear with our employee base that there's no connection between the payment of JobKeeper and the number of redundancies that we've had to implement, unfortunately, through the business. So to answer your question directly, at the end of March, our plans won't change for the number of redundancies or the focus we have on restructuring the business. The number of people who are stood down, as Andrew mentioned, some 9,000 from the end of March, we want them to come back. And when the borders open, domestically and internationally, we will have them back. So the intention is not, as a result of JobKeeper or the absence of Aviation Keeper, to revisit our redundancy numbers.
So, well, thanks. That's a nice segue. So, to refer to reports from internal documents that from the Sydney Morning Herald reported on the 7th of September 2020, where supposedly, understandably, the documents showed, the assertion is that the documents showed that Qantas planned to exit ground services by 2020. And that was an internal document that the Sydney Morning Herald said it was leaked to it. During those 10 years, Qantas has made record profits, did not upgrade equipment, and this was the year given as a key reason for outsourcing 2,500 jobs because of COVID. But in actual fact, it had been a plan the company had all the way along. Is that correct?
Andrew David or Andrew Finch? Who do you want?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer that. Senator, look, I can tell you, here's the facts. February 2000 last year, we were hiring people into the business, including into our ground operations business. we were investing in equipment to turn aircraft. We had a plan to invest $80 million over the next 5 years in equipment for ground operations. And indeed, every 6 months I was attending internal roadshows with those staff to explain exactly that. And we had been rolling out equipment. COVID hit. We lost 11 billion in revenue. We ended up in a crisis situation that meant we've had to recapitalise, had to resize the business, and we have to restructure to ensure that when we come through this pandemic, we are in a position where we can grow and start hiring people back into the business. We've identified in total $1 billion of initiatives that will take cost out of this business. Unfortunately, that means letting go of 8,500 people across the entire group. And it's been a very, very sad time for the whole industry, and certainly a sad time for us. I don't know a company who's been hit harder by this pandemic than we have in Australia. And we were in our 100th year. And it's been a very sad year. So let me just, I'll come to your point. So what we've done is we've looked at ground operations, and we've been very, very clear. Outsourcing to providers that we already used in 55 of 65 airports saves $100 million. It avoids $80 million of capital spend that we no longer have that capital, and it totally variabilises our cost base, which has proved to be essential in these uncertain times because, as you would understand, we can't afford to have high fixed cost in the business. It has been a very, very sad time. I personally spoke.
I think we're not talking about high fixed costs. We're talking about 2,500 workers that many of whom have been there for decades, supporting this airline through thick and thin. So we're not talking about costs. We're talking about those people that have been doing it hard as a result of this, and they've been replaced. That's what I'm asking you about. Was it 10 years ago? Can you please answer this? I've given you a fair go. Was it 10 years ago? There was a document prepared by Qantas that there was an intention to exit ground services by 2020. Does that document exist?
I can tell you, Senator, I've worked at 6 airlines. Every airline would have a document at some stage that would have looked at ground operations. All airlines around the world use external providers. I can tell you, last year, we were hiring into ground operations. We had no intention outsourcing ground operations. Then the crisis.
I'm asking you this question very directly, and it can be a yes or a no. Is there a document, an internal document from 10 years ago that said that ground services will be exited by 2020? Is there a Qantas document to that effect?
There is a Qantas document that looks at ground operations and the benefits of using external providers. As far as I'm aware, I don't have the document in front of me, Senator. It makes no reference to our current situation. I can tell you, right, in the time that I've been...
Does it include 2020, Mr. David? I'm asking you a very specific question. And would you be able to table that document of what the intent was regards ground services being exited?
I might reference to Mr. Finch at this point because I do not have the details of specifically what it says in that document, Senator.
I haven't seen the document. I don't know if that document exists, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did. We look at all elements of our business all the time. The fact that it mentioned 2020, if it in fact did so, is as likely as mentioning any other year for a reform or a restructure package in our business. Not surprisingly, in a business that has massive fixed costs the way we do and variable revenue, we look at all elements of our cost base all the time. So if there is a document in 2010, I think you said, there's probably a document in every year subsequent, looking at ground operations, flight operations, aircraft. I don't know if that document exists, Mr. Sheldon, but I think the point Mr. David is trying to make is that whether it existed or not, it was irrelevant going into COVID. As we entered 2020, we were hiring people. So whatever that document said 10 years ago, it was irrelevant to our plans going into 2020. COVID changed everything. It's changed this organisation fundamentally, including ground operations.
Well, I'm very mindful that there was industrial agreements being negotiated during that period as well, which means that people could take protected industrial action. So hiring people at the beginning of the year and what the intention of the company was once those industrial agreements were entered into would seem that there's every possibility that the company was intending, as it subsequently has done, terminating and outsourcing 2,500 workers. And when you talk about capital costs, we are talking about 2,500 hard-working Qantas employees that have worked for this company for decades that you exited. So when we are talking about capital costs, I think we're going to be actually saying about the human consequence of the decisions this company has made and the consequences for this company not having those skilled workers available.
No, couldn't agree more. No one has fronted more employees than Andrew David on the screen here personally to deliver this very hard news. I think the capital cost that you're referring to is Mr David's reference to the $80 million capital expenditure that's required over the next 5 years were we not to have outsourced. It's quite separate from the cost efficiencies that were delivered by the decision to outsource. But absolutely through no fault of their own, these 2,500 employees on a group-wide basis have, like 6,000 of their colleagues, borne the brunt of the COVID pandemic. And it's very unfortunate, and we've all seen some of our closest colleagues have to leave the business. 25% of the executive base has had to leave the business too, Mr Sheldon. So we've all been personally affected by this, and we're in many ways devastated from it. If you heard Alan Joyce speak at the press club not so long ago, you would have heard his words to that effect.
Yes, he's done the maths and he's turned around and decided that 2,500 workers that have been there have been outsourced to other players. Those people that have been working there for decades are no longer working there. Now, it was quite clearly that there's been plans from the company to do this at some given point, and under the guise of COVID, they've implemented it.
I disagree. There were no plans going into 2020 to do that.
Well,
the document that you refer
so
to, which
you're saying on
seen,
one hand there is plans about outsourcing workers, that the company is consistently looking at outsourcing workers, and that as an option, and you're saying that wasn't an option being considered in 2020.
I'm saying I haven't seen that document in 2010, but it would not surprise me that it canvassed the possibility or the potential for outsourcing at that time, as other documents may well have done so in the period since. And other restructuring or efficiency initiatives or investigations or proposals would have, over that period, also investigated costs out across the business. But there was no proposal, there was no plan going into 2020 to outsource ground operations. As Andrew said, we were hiring into ground operations in 2020, in February 2020. And then
prior to
COVID
enterprise bargaining agreements being settled, yes.
Sorry?
Prior to enterprise bargaining agreements being settled, yes, in those areas.
There was one still to be settled,
Yes,
I believe.
a major
That's right.
one, yes.
Correct.
Yes. If I want to go to this point about how you've dealt with COVID and the company's approach, and any one of the Andrews, happy to have answer it. Are you aware that there was improvement notices that were given by the New South Wales Safe Work on March the 2nd, 2020, about cleaning processes and procedures that are required that hadn't been applied by Qantas prior to that?
Andrew David, would you like to answer that?
Yes, we were aware of the PIN, Senator, as you would expect of a company that focuses on safety like we do.
And on February the 2nd, prior to that Safe Work, New South Wales issuing those requirements of improvement notices to bring basic safety equipment to the workforce there, that a employee was suspended. Mr. Theo Seremet, I'm going to pronounce his name incorrectly maybe here, but Seremetidis, Seremetitis, I think, and I'll just say call him Theo, was stood down by Qantas after advising colleagues that if they didn't have safety equipment that it may be unsafe when they were asked to offload and clean a plane that had come from Wuhan.
I'm going to ask Mr. Finch to respond if you want to talk to specifics around that case with Theo. What I can tell you is that we take all people and operational safety matters very seriously and address them appropriately. Andrew, I don't know if you want to make specific comments on this one case, one individual.
Let's call him Theo. Theo was directed not to attend work because, in Qantas's view, without any reasonable basis, he had directed workers not to do certain work.
But didn't, on March the 2nd, 2020, Theo's assertions were, and the workforce rights to withdraw labour when it's a pending, believed to be a pending risk. Wasn't the 2nd of March 2020 Safe Work New South Wales confirming his concerns?
No, I don't believe so. Safe Work, in fact, it's still subject to an open investigation by Safe Work New South Wales.
They were confirming his concerns about, his concerns as I understand, and that he was raising concerns about not having the right safety equipment or training to deal with the Wuhan plan. Subsequently, on the 2nd of March, which you've already confirmed, there was an improvement notice given by Safe Work in regarding procedures, which were the heart of the issues that were raised by Theo.
I think you may be conflating my knowledge of the situation was that improvement notice related to cleaning inside aircraft, whereas Theo's concerns related to work by baggage and ramp staff outside the aircraft. And on the basis of the medical advice at the time, Qantas was of the view...
That's not correct.
Okay.
It was regarding, Theo was regarding, it was health safety representative, duly elected under the Act.
Yep.
As I understand, he spoke to the workers that were doing the cleaning and were required to do cleaning, including vomit, blood on seats, perspiration, people coughing, presumably, that had arrived from Wuhan. And those workers said that they were concerned that they had not been trained. They did not have equipment to deal with that cleaning arrangements on that plane. The workers had a meeting and said, look, until we get that safety equipment and get proper training, we're reluctant to put our families at risk or the rest of the airline at risk or our work colleagues at risk. And he was subsequently stood down for that action.
My understanding is that it was unrelated to that act, to that improvement notice. And the improvement notice we acquitted with under Safe Works supervision subsequently, and we've had absolutely no issue and no further issues from Safe Work or indeed any of the HSRs since that time. So we were in a learning phase in that early stage of the coronavirus in Australia, and we conceded at the time that the processes needed to be improved. They were improved almost instantly. But I'll have to call him Theo like you, Senator. Theo's direction not to attend work was as a result of him directing employees not to do work on which he had no reasonable basis to provide that direction.
I'm just going to ask this question just straight to you again.
Yeah.
There is a series of equipment that's required, gloves, cleaning facility, cleaning, training that's required on the 2nd of March that you accept as an appropriate direction given by Safe Work New South Wales to Qantas and at Qantas Ground Services. The issues that were raised by Theo were going to those points about gloves, cleaning equipment and training that took place only a month beforehand, where he was concerned about the Wuhan flight. So I don't think they're conflated. I think they're directly relevant to each other. I'm trying to ascertain, what is Qantas's view about employees doing the right thing, protecting safety of the airline, comparison with corporate instructions about what they want to see happen. Get them off the plane, let's make a quid, let's sack 2,500 workers and outsource them to somewhere else. And let's people like Theo, who are standing up for the interests of the company, the country and their workforce, are stood down, even when they're subsequently seen the basis of the stand down was ill-placed.
The company takes its obligations for the safety of its people and its employees extremely seriously, and after that improvement notice, significant improvements were made to the processes, the availability of PPE for our employees on board the aircraft. My understanding is that Theo's directions were unrelated to the cleaning of the aircraft, the interior of the aircraft. But he was not stood down as a result of his direction. He was stood down as a result of the airline essentially being grounded. The investigation by Safe Work New South Wales is still open, as I understand.
Well, sorry, Mr. Finch, that's just blatantly incorrect. He was stood down, and the company gave a clear direction he was stood down because of exercising his responsibilities as a health and safety representative.
That is patently wrong, Senator. He was not stood down.
Well,
for,
Mr. Finch,
for that reason.
I would suggest that you go and I'll put you on notice to come back, because I am very clearly, and I've seen the court documents of the reasons why the company stood him down, and why he was stood down. It was because of the exercising his health and safety responsibilities on behalf of the company and the workforce.
That's
no.
your interpretation, not the court's.
It's also factually incorrect.
Just one comment.
No. Sorry, Mr. Parker. This goes to the heart of the cavalier approach by this company to workers, and the 2,500 workers that were outsourced, workers in Australian Capital Territory in Canberra Airport that have just recently been put out of their jobs. I mean, I've seen this company turn around and now replace 2,500 workers, and then get divisions of its own labour hire company to replace and to expand and replace those workers in the various parts of their operation and airports around the country. It seems like a very cavalier way of approaching Qantas workers and people that have worked hard for this company. Now, Qantas is not Alan Joyce, and it certainly isn't the three of you. It is the workforce and all of you. And the way this company has approached those individuals is tantamount to, is an outrageous consideration after the billions of dollars, over $1 billion that we've given in support as a community, as taxpayers, to this airline. I don't begrudge that support at all. What I begrudge is how you've used it and lack of responsibility that the company has taken for the way that they've approached these workers like Theo and others.
Senator, a couple of comments from me. First of all, the kind of culture you're implying we would have in Qantas, we wouldn't be the safest airline in the world if we had the kind of culture that you're implying. We do not have that culture in this business, full stop.
Well, you just got rid of 2,500 workers and replaced them, so you don't really value them, do you, your culture? Because it's not your company.
I can tell you safety is top of mind for every single decision we make. And none of us went into the start of last year with the intent to want to get rid of 8,500 people, not just the 2,500 in ground operations, none of us.
Mr. David, you
And it
just
has
gave
been
an
a very,
evidence.
very sad.
Mr. David, just due respect.
Please do.
Due respect, you've given evidence that there is an ongoing review of ground services. Mr. Finch has given that evidence. You say other airlines do that. You say your airline does that. So don't say that there was never an intention or a desire to turn around and put people off. There has been an ongoing intention to look at costs.
I beg to differ, and I do not disagree with you. In February 2019, we were. Let me speak to the facts, and we need to move on because there's other questions I'm sure the committee want to cover. But let me speak to the facts. In February of last year, we were hiring pilots, we were hiring cabin crew, we were hiring people into ground operations in Qantas. That is the fact. COVID hit. We lost 11 billion of revenue. We had our backs to the wall. We've had to make some very, very difficult decisions. And it's been hard on all of us. Full stop.
Thank you, and we'll move on. Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for your attendance today. I'm particularly keen to focus on what the future of aviation is in this country and what is the best pathway forward, and particularly given that the 100 years anniversary of Qantas and my connection to Cloncurry, the birthplace, the genuine birthplace of Qantas. That's getting political for you, Senator Sheldon. We will have a period to go with COVID. We're commencing vaccinations in this country, but I am keen to understand how we better address border closures and the lack of certainty for flights, for passengers, for your workforce, for bookings. Can you tell me what discussions you've had with the various state premiers that would give us some certainty that, you know, if you book a flight for business or holidays or family reunions, that there'll be some, some sense that you might actually be able to carry that out?
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Chair. We have now spoken in the last, let's say, 10 days with most premiers and chief ministers, and we've focused on three things. The first is, as the vaccine rollout commences and groups 1A and 1B are vaccinated, frontline workers, quarantine workers, all of those who are most exposed to this pandemic, that can they give an assurance publicly to restore confidence that hard border closures, that snapbacks of borders will be a thing of the past? And we are pleased that premiers and chief ministers, by and large, are stating that they now think that such decisions would be at the very extreme, and that ranges from Janet Young, who I think made comments, it would be an extreme measure to go back to hard border closures, and the premiers that we've spoken to are similarly of that mindset. We've also asked for, if that was to be the extreme option and they felt they had no other choice based on medical advice, could there be greater notice built into this system so that we could give people certainty and confidence they could get back to their home state? Because as we referenced in the opening remarks, about 70% of our customers are saying their number one reason for not feeling confident about flying is because they worry they won't be able to get home. So we've been discussing what is an appropriate timeframe that we, Qantas and Jetstar, could put on additional capacity to get everyone back to state X, be that 48 hours ideally, perhaps it's 24 as a worst case scenario. And again, we've had a reasonable response, is my characterisation, from the premiers and chief ministers to that concept. And then finally, it is how can we continue to work at a national cabinet level and AHPPC in consistent rules, border passes, traffic light systems, so that there is a greater understanding by the community, because at the moment there is enormous confusion on what works and how and why. And I think there is positive intent from not all, but most premiers ahead of National Cabinet that they need to continue to work on a solution for that national consistency and approach.
I'm pleased to hear that, and no doubt hopefully any of the media who are covering this will be able to start communicating that greater sense of certainty, because it's certainly been harrowing for decision making for people right across Australia, hasn't it? And they will welcome that. I fly within Queensland mostly, or down to here a lot, and I've been so impressed with flight crew across all the airlines who have remained incredibly positive, even in light of the difficult business decisions that have had to be made. And across every airline, they really are a credit to the industry and their desire to get planes in the air and flying to provide themselves with job certainty and security, and to continue moving Australians. Because I am regionally based, that is primarily my focus, and understanding what Qantas is doing in this space about servicing regional routes. Can you talk me through, given the uncertainty across border sectors, have you been able to continue or introduce new sectors in regional Australia?
Yeah, and I might get Andrew David to mention that topic. I just would begin by saying that we have introduced over 20 new routes that are predominantly regional Australia, and it speaks, I guess, to how different the world is for us, which is we're trying different routes, intrastate travel where you've got certainty in terms of movement, routes which we know people are very keen on, plus experimenting with whole different routes that we think are leisure focused, for example. And it does come back to the importance of border consistency, that those routes be allowed to succeed. But Andrew, would you like to add anything further?
Yeah, thanks. Obviously, the government support with the RANS program's been important as well. But as you pointed out, Senator, our roots go back 100 years to to regional Australia. In the last 4 months, we've announced 26 new routes. As Andrew referenced, a number of those are in regional Australia. In the last 10 years, we have only ever pulled out of 2 regional routes. We pulled out of Gove and we pulled out of Beelawilla. They're the only 2 that we've come out of. We're very much committed to regional Australia. And as Senator Sterle knows, we've focused on fares as well and continue to improve our residents' fare program, continue to focus on fares to make sure that travel is affordable in regional Australia as well. So we're very much committed to regional Australia. We have a fleet of turboprop and jet aircraft that we can use in many markets, and we're continuing to grow that capability. So we're not going anywhere when it comes to regional Australia.
Terrific, because I think we talk about passenger movements, but one of the stark realisations when COVID started and airlines stopped flying was, cardiac services and dialysis services and, cancer treatments in regional communities that stopped because we couldn't get specialists or medicines in. Not to mention mail and, other freight services. So, I think there was evidence given earlier today about the importance of aviation to Australia and whether they be airfields or airlines. It's all very important. So back to the future of aviation. The Minister has a future of aviation sector flying to recovery process. If we look through this COVID recovery and beyond, have you engaged in that process and provided input?
We met last week with the panel. We provided a submission prior to that, and it was a good discussion. And we think it's timely that whilst there is enormous focus, including this inquiry, on the impact of COVID, and that's our primary focus. We also want to ensure that out of this, that we do have a roadmap for aviation in the next 5 years to deal with recovery, to deal with how we can do things better. And I think some of these government programs that have assisted us, for example, on security, are really important topics for future discussion and policy outcomes that can deal with the cost impacts on aviation, such as the very high security costs. And there would just be one other thing we would call out. For us, as we come out of this crisis, one of the single largest policy areas we all have to grapple with is climate change and its impact on aviation. And for us, and we are one of the few airlines in the world with a carbon neutral 2050 commitment. And on that pathway, sustainable aviation fuels are critical for us. We think there is a real role for Australia at a national and state level in the development of these fuels. We think it's a big opportunity for the economy, for regional Australia in terms of production, but it's going to be the critical component as we transition to a different company that will meet its obligations in terms of emission reduction. So that is the one area that we called out to the panel, and we are very focused on above and beyond COVID as a critical part of our future.
Thank you. I'm really interested to hear that. I'm keen to understand what new jobs there would be available in regional Australia as we work through this change of fuel usage. So that's very interesting. So would it be fair to say then that during the COVID period, or as we move out of COVID, that the extension of RANs and DANs would be something that you would be supporting?
Absolutely. It has been critical, as we mentioned, in terms of minimum flying connectivity that you referenced, passengers as well as freight. It's kept our employees in work. But because of the uncertainty and because of fluctuating confidence, because of the many unknowns of what the next 6 to 12 months might look like. A continuation of those models we see as critical. It's a very well-devised policy in terms of as soon as there is commercial incentive, we come out of the program to add additional frequencies once routes build. But we've seen a history with the DANS and RANS program of we might have taken minimum flying in the programs out into the commercial arena only to have to bring them back into DANS and RANS because demand evaporated because primarily borders. So we think there is definitely life in those programs left, and the role they play is highly important.
And finally, just on this immediate requirement, you talked about a suite of packages, so a combination of currency training, I'm assuming is where you're going with that, as well as some program to continue to tie employees to workplaces. Is that a fair summary of what you're suggesting when you say a suite of packages?
It is, and that's been the basis of our discussions with the federal government and Department of Infrastructure and Treasury, amongst others, that it's a suite of packages of keeping employees connected, employee support, supporting the airline so we can do as much flying as possible, and boosting skills and training in safety and currency wherever possible.
All right, thank you, Chair.
Senator McDonald. Sheldon, you have one last one, and then I just want one quick one.
Yeah, good, thanks. Look, I just want to draw, for those listening, and also maybe extract some comments from one of the Andrews that are so confident about Qantas's safety record, about how they approach employees. A report in the ABC on Thursday, the 2nd of April 2020, where a Qantas spokesman said the airline would work with Safe Work New South Wales on an investigation into the dismissal of Theo. And this is the quote from the Qantas spokesman. A union delegate was stood down pending an investigation after incorrectly telling employees it was not safe to work on aircraft arriving from China in early February, he said. It goes on to say that, and I quote, it was against from the individual spokesperson for Qantas, it was against the advice of health authorities and despite additional safety equipment being provided to employees. Now, I just want, because I think I'll give you a chance to correct the record. That's the reason that was given by the spokesperson, that he was stood down. Is that correct?
That's not correct. He was not stood down because of his direction, which we say was without basis. So that quote from the spokesperson is either a misquote or a mistake by the person. He was stood down because the airline is essentially grounded at the time. He was directed not to attend work, if the committee wants to get down into that level of detail, because, as we said, he had directed employees not to do their work without any reasonable basis to do so. So there's a distinction between stood down and directed not to attend work. I'm sure you understand the difference, Senator.
So you're making the point he was directed not to attend work. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Right. Because he turned around and operated his, carried out his responsibilities as a health and safety representative.
I can say it one more time. He was directed not to attend work because he told employees not to do their work without any reasonable basis to do so. I can say it again, if you like.
You can say it as many times as you like. I'm very clear what the spokesman said, and I'm sure the journalists will be very interested to say that this
I'm happy to speak to the journalists.
Spokesperson didn't say that at all. So I'll leave that for the journalists to say whether they've correctly
if he
quoted your company or whether they've actually got it wrong. I'll leave that for the journalists to interpret, Mr. Finch, your comments on behalf of Qantas in conflict with what was previously said regarding the stand down and what's been said in the worker no longer being engaged to carry out work, and what is actually said by the Industrial Relations Commission, because Mr. Finch, it is not the way you're characterising it at all.
Right. I agree.
Right.
There's a disparity.
Okay, just one last quick one, and I'll go to you, Mr. David, if I may. You said that you were hoping, or Qantas was hoping, to assume 40 to 50% of your international business by November. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Yeah, and then builds from there. That's yeah.
Sure. May I just ask on what did you base that assumption on?
So we've made assumptions around rollout of vaccine, both within Australia and globally, and based on conversations we've had with the government as well, we have made an assumption, and it is purely that at this stage, a plan that assumes that we will be able to operate international destinations over the Christmas period. To give people comfort that are booking travel over that Christmas period, we've made sure that all fares are fully flexible so people can change them in the event that events were to differ from that plan. And that plan sees us operating to all the destinations we were previously operating to other than New York and Santiago, where we would be initially using partners of ours to operate into those destinations. And then hopefully what we'll see through 22 is we build and add more services back in. Eventually, by about 2024, according to our current plan, we'll get back to the levels that of travel and demand that we saw pre-COVID. Unfortunately, it is a long tail, and we don't envisage our A380s coming back into service until the end of 23.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks, Mr. David. Mr. Finch, Mr. Parker, thank you for your attendance. We know where you are should we need to follow up with anything else. Now